Hey guys, Modelling Weekly here. In today's build video, we'll be taking a look at an aircraft in a scheme that I actually made a while ago on the channel, except this time it'll be in 1/48th scale. It is of course the Folland Gnat T.1. This kit seems to have a lot of potential, so I'm excited to get started. Let's take a look in the box. Upon opening the box, you are greeted with the standard array of Airfix kit contents. These are of course the decals, instruction sheet and plastic parts, all of which are packed into a single plastic bag, with the exception to the clear parts, which thankfully have their own bag. Taking a closer look at the parts themselves, I was actually pleasantly surprised. All of the recessed panel lines seem to be perfectly in scale, with little to no flash at all. This was a very good start. The cockpit in this kit also features some fantastic little details, with the instrument panels standing out in particular thanks to their intricate raised dial and switch details. I'll definitely be having a crack at painting these later on. The kit's design and engineering in general also seems to be well considered and thought out, so I'm looking forward to testing out the kit's fit and overall build quality. In terms of the decals, I've not got anything in particular to remark. They're cartograph, and with that I have my full faith in them. All the colours look lovely and sharp, so this is fantastic stuff. In general, the clear parts are looking nice and clear, however there are a couple of light scuffs here and there that would need buffing out to achieve a perfect finish. Still though, it's all very nice stuff. As per usual, the build was kicked off with work on the cockpit tub. This went together really nicely and also pretty quickly without sacrificing any details or elements. All construction work throughout this build was carried out with Tamiya extra thin cement thanks to its highly versatile nature. Once the major cockpit elements had been assembled, it was time for a lick of paint. Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black to be exact. This was applied to the entire cockpit, including the fuselage sidewalls that would be visible through the canopy later on. All primer work was carried out with my 0.4mm nozzle to accommodate for the larger particle size. With the primer applied, I moved on to adding a little bit of mottled pre-shading in order to give the upcoming cockpit grey a little bit more variation. For this purpose, I switched back to a smaller 0.15mm nozzle and made sure to spray as close to the surface as possible to make sure my mottling was tight and controlled. Details that would catch the light more than others were focused on at this stage in order to add extra realism. The cockpit grey was then blocked in, making use of Mr. Colour C13 medium grey, as it almost exactly matched the colours I saw in reference pictures. At this stage, I made sure to spray it as a translucent layer in order to allow the pre-shading to show through. Before we continue on with some detail painting, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to all of my Modelling Weekly channel members here on YouTube. Your support is absolutely invaluable and I can't thank you all enough. If you'd like to find out more about what being a channel member entails, along with the perks available, feel free to click that join button down below for more information. Anyway, on with some finer brushwork. The first elements that I tackled were these lovely instrument panels that I mentioned earlier. I began by blocking in all of the dials with a slightly lightened black tone from Baekel, making use of my wet palette along with a fine natural hair brush. Once I was happy with this layer, I moved on to picking out the different indicators with white, which served to bring the instrument panel alive, so to speak. This was applied almost as a dry brush layer, as I was super conscious of not applying it in the wrong areas. After all of this, I brought out some Baeco Scarlet and used this to add some final touches along with some extra interest. Not too bad in the end, it's certainly nicer than the kit decals. It was now time for the pilot's ejection seats to get a bit of love. The seat padding was initially given a layer of Baeco camouflage green, which was thinned once again using my wet palette to avoid adding brush stroke marks to the model. Looking at reference shots, these additional pads tend to be of a lighter tan shade, so they were picked out next with a fine brush and Baeco model colour khaki grey. A super nice touch that I forgot to mention about this kit was the seat belts moulded into the seats. Whilst they aren't super detailed, they do serve their purpose and are more than suitable considering you'll hardly be able to see them once the aircraft's canopy is sealed up. These were picked out with a sort of greyish black tone. The seat cushion details were then finished off with a slight bit of shading, which I used to try and highlight the subtle detail moulded onto the cushions themselves. This was simply the same camouflage green as before, except this time I added a bit of white to lighten it up. Now for a bit of chipping. Making use of Tamiya Sky Grey thinned with isopropyl alcohol, I added some highlights and scuffs to the rest of the paintwork in order to give the cockpit a more heavily used and tired appearance. Overall, this helped to tie the cockpit tub all together and gave it a vital bit of extra visual interest. With that done, the instrument panels could be glued into place. Before the cockpit tub could be sealed into the fuselage, however, I had to deal with the air intakes that sit either side of it. In order to tackle these, I first made use of a Mysticolor gloss black tone, which serves as a perfect initial layer for some metallic application later on. The metallic paint in question here was a stainless steel shade from the Mysticolor Super Metallic range. For me, this tone is a perfect balance between gunmetal and silver, so I make use of it quite frequently when anything to do with an aircraft's interior is involved. At this point, I could now work on assembling the fuselage along with all of its interior components. This included the side bulges, as I like to call them, along with the air intakes and cockpit tub itself. It's at this point that I'd just like to point out the incredible engineering and near flawless fit of this kit. All of these interior parts fitted seamlessly together with no difficulty whatsoever. It was an absolutely wonderful process overall. When it came to fitting the wings to the fuselage, this was really the only time where I encountered a gap. The back of the wing assembly doesn't really fit snugly into the rest of the fuselage, as you can see in the video, so this would require a bit of filler later on. Not a biggie though, so my view of the kit was still sky high. With regard to the canopy masking, this was a very nice process indeed. As the Gnat doesn't really have any canopy struts, the entire masking job could be completed with a single piece of Tamiya flexible masking tape, with the rest of the glass filled in with Bioco masking fluid, as can be seen in the video. This stuff was applied with an old tatty brush, as it can be a bit of a pain to remove from the bristles afterwards. With this crucial step done, I could get spraying. The first stage was of course to spray the canopy with its interior C13 shade, as we don't want the interior to have bright white struts. It was then primer time. For the first time ever, I actually used Mr. Surfacer 1500 white in order to prime this aircraft. On reflection, this was a very good choice. It's one of the nicest, if not the best, white paints I've ever sprayed, challenging even AKRC to that title. It also killed two birds with one stone, as I could both prime the model and spray the white sections of the camouflage scheme at the same time. The next part of the scheme that I decided to spray were the grey wing undersides, which would make use of Tamiya Sky Grey as an almost exact match. Before applying this shade, however, I decided to add some basic mottled pre-shading, just to add a bit of extra interest. I intended to keep this aircraft pretty clean and crisp, as it seemed to be that way in a lot of reference pictures, however I couldn't help myself from messing around with the grey a little bit. This mottling was intentionally shaky, by the way. I'm not just having some kind of shaking episode just yet. As previously mentioned, Tamiya Sky Grey acrylic was used to block in the colour on the undersides of the wings, making sure to keep the layer semi-translucent as to not fully obscure the pre-shading I carried out previously. With all of the white sections masked up off camera, I set to work on the lush red aspects of the scheme. I selected XF7 for this purpose after much deliberation, as I decided that it presented itself as the best match to online reference pictures that I could find. This colour was sprayed mostly uniformly, however I did make it slightly mottled in some places just to give the aircraft a touch of realism in the form of subtle sun damage. Some additional minor masking was then carried out in order to spray the black anti-glare panel found towards the pilot's canopy. This element really brings the scheme together in my opinion, and really adds a lot to the model's overall appearance. I then added a slight bit of shading to the anti-glare panel, making use of XF24 around the hinge area where the nose would pivot upwards to allow access to the avionics bay. Removing the masking tape was a nerve-wracking process, however with all of it removed, the paint job that remained was surprisingly neat, with very few leaks or oversprayed areas. This was very nice to see and definitely served as a huge relief. The final bit of paintwork that was required to seal the deal were these two little anti-slip panels either side of the canopy glass. Though they are sometimes supplied as kit decals, they weren't in this kit, so this was an essential step. Regardless, I prefer painting these kinds of things as it's just more realistic overall. Right, time for our first gloss coat of the video, with many more to come. For this build, I aim to create a mirror-like gloss finish, so I of course turned to the old reliable GX100 lacquer from Mr. Colour. This stuff was thinned with quite a hefty amount of Mr. Leveling thinner, and sprayed with my 0.4mm nozzle from a medium distance so that the coverage was acceptable. I laid this varnish down pretty thick on the surface, as thanks to the self-leveling properties of MLT, it would sort itself out in the end. Once the first layer had dried, I went in and applied a second, preparing the model nicely for the decal application stage. In my usual fashion, I made use of the classic combo micro set and sole for this kit's decals, which, as I expected in the beginning, were absolutely fantastic to apply. Massive kudos to Cartograph for creating some wonderfully consistent decals. Some were a tiny bit thicker than others and needed some persuading with extra micro sole, however this really wasn't an issue at all. With the decals applied and dry, it was time for gloss coat number 3. I went even thinner with this coat as I wanted the self-leveling properties of the MLT to be even further apparent. This also elongated the drying time of the varnish, which allowed it to eliminate any orange peel effects that may have formed if the drying time was too quick. Mixing up a bit with some sandpaper now, using 7000 grit wet and dry sandpaper, I brought the previous gloss layer down a tiny bit so that the following layers could benefit from an even smoother surface to sit on. It also helped to slightly unify the decals with the paintwork, as they would otherwise stick too prominently out from it. The fourth layer of gloss varnish then helped to restore the reflective nature of the finish that the sandpaper took away. As you can see in the video, it's starting to look properly glossy now. Despite the fact that I wanted the aircraft to be clean and factory fresh, I did choose to add a basic sepia panel line wash at this stage. This was down to the fact that whilst these aircraft were kept incredibly clean, there was an inevitable build-up of dirt in some of the panel lines, so adding this wash was a great way of signifying this whilst also making those surface details more visible on the whole. This wash was incredibly easy to add thanks to the gloss varnish layers underneath it, which accelerated the capillary action of the wash to a very efficient level. Once applied, I left the wash to dry for about half an hour and then removed any excess with a dry paper towel. Ordinarily at this point I would make use of a white spirit dampened brush or a cotton bud. However, thanks yet again to the glossy finish, the wash barely stuck to it, so it could be rubbed straight off with dry tissue paper. Tasked with sealing in the wash and further enhancing the glossy appearance was GX100 coat number 5. It's starting to look seriously shiny at this point, and I was very happy with how it was going. Whilst the 5th coat was still wet, I applied a 6th coat that was essentially just leveling thinner with about 5% varnish by volume. This helped to complete the look and level out that previous layer even further. With those final gloss layers, the main airframe was essentially complete. As a result, I could move on to adding some smaller, more intricate details. The first of which were the navigation lights featured on the aircraft wingtips, and in order to simulate a bulb inside of these clear parts, I drilled a small hole partway into them, and then filled the hole with clear green and clear red respectively. This created quite a nice effect in the end, as you can see in the video. The landing gear parts were all sprayed off camera with the same stainless steel metallic shade that I used for the interior earlier. These fitted pretty nicely with little to no fettling required. All that was left to do at this stage was remove the masks from the canopy, and the model was marked as complete. And here is the bright red gnat in all of its glory. I have to say this was an incredibly fun kit to make, with an almost flawless fit that took me by surprise. The title is no clickbait, this kit is genuinely a hidden gem. There's something truly endearing about the gnat, and when I saw this kit at a bargain price on eBay, I knew I had to pick it up. Whilst this scheme in particular was pretty challenging, and it did have its hardships, I'm pretty happy with the end result, and it gives off the effect that I was hoping for. The gloss varnish came out pretty nicely as well, which I was pretty happy about, as I wanted that to be the highlight of the model in general. There were some things I'd do differently, however, as with any model. These include exploring the use of polishing compounds to remove any remnants of texture in the final gloss effect, as despite it being pretty nice, there are some areas that have a tiny bit of orange peel. I'm not massively fussed with these, however, so it's not a huge drawback. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts down below though, so don't forget to leave a comment before you go. That's it from me today, so a massive thanks goes out yet again to all of my Modelling Weekly channel members, along with all of you for watching this far. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in next week's video. Bye!